Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today I'm excited to have my current Congressman Dan Bishop join us. He's a friend of mine and he's part of the House Freedom Caucus. And we get a little down and dirty in politics and especially on the Republican side on this episode. So it's a lot of fun. We'll, of course, then practice our 15 tools of learning with a recap of our discussion, as well as talking a little bit about recession. And finally, we will look at cryptocurrency with Will McCreary, and excited for you to join us.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Today, my guest is a North Carolina representative, my personal congressman, at least until November, Dan Bishop. He graduated with a law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he practiced in the private sector before being elected to Mecklenburg County's commission in North Carolina. In 2014, he was elected to the North Carolina House of Representatives, and in 2016 to the North Carolina Senate. And since 2019, Dan has represented North Carolina's 9th District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he is a member of the Homeland Security and Judiciary Committee. He is currently running for re-election, and he's also my favorite congressman in the whole entire United States.
Thanks, Robert. That's a very nice introduction, especially that last sentence or two. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that.
So tell us, what's different this time around running for the House of Representatives versus when you first were elected in 2019?
Well, Robert, I imagine with your classical conversations, you probably have a reach that extends well beyond North Carolina. But North Carolinians will be able to relate to this, I think. I came in a special election after the 2018 congressional election in the 9th District fell apart, allegations of some vote harvesting in a remote county. And the biggest thing about it was I didn't have a real plan to go to Congress. I was really sort of inclined to wrap up my state legislative career and get back to practicing law. But when that situation came along, I thought, as it turned out, we were going to lose the 9th District unless someone was able to enter that could bring to bear what needed to be done to win that race. But I would say, if you go to that race, and that's special in 2019, was elected in September 2019. It was just an enormously hectic time. It turned out to be the second most expensive special election for Congress in history. The White House was involved. Donald Trump is probably the only president in history that would have reached out and helped a guy who was 9.5 points down in the polls.
Wow.
Because I was being outspent just, like 10-1. Notwithstanding everything we had raised. We had a primary, abbreviated primary with 10 candidates there. And then we went on to the general. The president was involved. Donald Trump Jr. and Kim Guilfoyle came to do events. The vice president did 3 events for us over time. So that was very hectic. And then 2 weeks after I entered Congress was when the first impeachment proceedings began against President Trump. So there's a certain hecticness around that. And then immediately I had to pivot and run again in the regular cycle to run for Congress again in November 2020. My district changed because of litigation in North Carolina. That's when I ended up representing Moore County, where you reside. And so the biggest difference between then and now is I've had enough time to sort of get my feet on the ground in Congress. I've gotten comfortable. You have some butterflies no matter whenever you step into a stage that is new. And I think it's been, so with the benefit of having some more relaxed schedule, a 2-year term before really being up for election again, a very substantially changed district again, but one which is a very clear, a very good match for the district philosophically, and I think in good shape. And it's allowed me to start taking a little bit more of a more national view of the problems that we confront and what needs to be done to respond to them. So I'm settling into the Judiciary Committee, where I serve with Ranking Member Jim Jordan of Ohio, and that's frankly my favorite committee. I've been on the Homeland Security Committee. That committee could be, Republicans could be better on that committee in my judgment, but I'm trying to bring the same toughness there that Jim's made the rule of the day at the Judiciary Committee. So That's kind of I guess that's the sum up. I would think it's a little less hectic, a little more opportunity to grow into someone who's looking at the national picture and trying to fight out the values war that we're having at that level.
And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. One of the things I've really appreciated with you is just your tax view and in favor of low taxes. I know I have a libertarian spirit, and to me, taxation is theft, and the federal government takes so much of it. But why is it important to you? What have you seen with what the federal government does with our tax dollars?
Robert, you've summed it up right there pretty well. I do think it is fundamentally an issue of freedom. I was with a business owner recently, very successful business owner, was just spending a little time meeting the person, and he told me the number of millions, and I won't repeat that, and I certainly won't identify the business, that he had been required to pay in first quarter taxes. It was a large sum. And he immediately followed that shortly in that conversation by posing the rhetorical question, what could he do with that 19 or whatever it was $1 million? I guess I did come out with a number, in lieu of what the federal government was likely to do with that money. It's something for everyone always to remember when we're talking about taxes, resources being removed from the people who are all over this country doing their thing in the private economy and the good that they do. That's what the free market system provides, is the freedom for everyone to be their best for each other and to provide services and goods to each other that all of us want to improve our quality of life. And whenever you take that money and you plunk it down into the federal bureaucracy, you are doing two things. Whatever that good that does from the federal government, and maybe it won't do much good at all. That's what I worry about a lot. But clearly, you have to take away whatever could happen in the private economy with that money. It impairs every individual's freedom in some way to do what they want to do in life and what will bring the best value to others.
Yeah, in a true free market economy, a person's earnings are based on what they've done for other people, that they've done good for other people. Other people have willingly parted with their funds in exchange for their services. And the more that you're able to do that, the better off that you are. And theoretically, the better off your customers are. But when the government takes from that and puts it into their own bureaucracy, not only are you paying for that bureaucracy, but you're stopping those individuals from investing in their own businesses. I know when we got the latest tax cut, we were able to increase our bonus pool, so our employees were able to directly benefit from that, and we were able to pay more. And I'm kind of worried at what's going to happen if these taxes continue to go up.
Yep.
And I'm also worried about what happens if our, trillions and trillions of dollars we're in debt continue to go up as well. So we appreciate that we have such a lion in Congress with you. And,
Robert, if I can interject one more thing on the point, you just made reference to the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And one thing that's very interesting about that, Americans should not fail to note, including your listeners, is that the revenues that have come to Congress are far more than the CBO projected. So the growth that produces by people engaging in voluntary transactions, not compelled transactions in the form of taxes, but anytime you can loosen up that thing and deliver more freedom to the people, the productivity that comes from it, not just from a numbers point of view, but as you say, in terms of improving the quality of people's lives all over the country, wherever possible, that ought to be our top and primary value, in my view.
We know that we read the news and see that violence is increasing across the United States. And obviously, as inflation rages, that makes it harder for people to earn a decent living, or even why earn a decent living when you're just going to get your wages stolen from you by inflation. But we have heard about these autonomous zones, and a lot of times they get a lot of federal dollars. Can you tell me about this bill in Congress that you're sponsoring that really defunds this lawlessness?
I'll speak about that specifically, Robert, then maybe broaden it out if I might a little bit. So I introduced I think it's No Cash for Autonomous Zones Act or something. I've forgotten the exact name, CHOP. I remember that was what it's called. But it was a reaction to the fact that in Portland, when anarchists, I think, burned out or chased the police out of a precinct and blocked off a multi-block area of downtown Seattle. In fact, I think they call it the Capitol Hill District. And they held it, and authorities let them do that and let them hold that for weeks. And we introduced that bill in that process. There are a number of bills you introduce in Congress sort of to draw attention to things and to make points, particularly when you're in the minority and don't have the votes to pass them. That was sort of at the front end of a general mantra among the left in this country against law and order, against orderly conduct and promotion of violence and disorder in cities. At the time of the autonomous zone in Seattle, of course, the result within several weeks were there were several people who were shot, and I think a couple died. That's what happens when you don't have law and order. And to go back to our taxes question you opened with, that is the legitimate purpose for government to tax the people, is to make sure to provide for law and order so that people's, again, their rights in property and their ability to engage in those transactions we talk about is protected against criminals. And unfortunately, even as Democrats or leftists are even more and more in favor of taxing higher and higher, they ironically enough seem to be against that basic purpose of government. So they move from things like the semi-autonomous zone in Seattle to the whole mantra of being in favor of defunding police, abolishing police. They use this rhetoric consistently throughout 2020. We saw murders go up, the highest increases in many, many decades. And then that has continued in 2021 and 2022. Homicides and violent crimes in city after city have been on the rise. And so the point there was a tremendous amount of federal money probably shouldn't really appropriately flow from federal government into local policing organizations. That ought to be done at the state and local level. But given that money was going there, why would taxpayers in North Carolina be required to subsidize that kind of anti-law and order policy on the municipal level in Seattle? So, and I still think that applies. If they want to be against law and order, they ought to do it with their own money at the least, at their own, they're in their local community.
Yeah, and I think we've obviously seen a number of businesses and individuals moving from those areas that have decided to embrace lawlessness for places that believe in the right order of government, right? There are things that the Bible says the government should do, and justice in making sure that happens is one of those. Speaking of violence, there's been a couple of mass shootings recently that have been televised, and of course the ones that get stopped because of a concealed carry permit holder or someone who stepped in doesn't get the publicity. But the Second Amendment, I always say, is the amendment that protects all the other amendments.
True.
So why do you think the Second Amendment is so important today? And then we know that President Biden recently signed what I call a liberal gun grabbing, red flag, illegal bill to regulate guns more. So what is the purpose of the Second Amendment in your mind, and what's the role of the federal government in that?
Robert, I just was, even before getting on your podcast, I was just at lunch with a group and just an informal group. And one person told me afterward that his spouse had said, these mass killings are because these young kids get these military style weapons, and I'm never going to vote for another Republican until they solve that problem. That is such, and without any intending to denigrate anybody out there, the problem with that is that it's a comprehensively ignorant point of view. It doesn't know, it lacks awareness of the reason for the Second Amendment, the reason for the right to keep and bear arms, what the dangers are of the reverse. Well, let me say, before I even get to that point, the ineffectiveness in terms of allaying violence of going out and starting to progressively and increasingly always restrict gun rights, and the enormous danger, the existential danger to liberty that would be represented by the ultimate solution that you'd have to get to if they think that's going to stop violence, which is to confiscate weapons across the board, and the loss that would be entailed there is freedom, the loss of the. So backing up, what not just Thomas Jefferson, not just James Madison, not just Joseph Story in his commentaries on the Constitution in the middle of the 19th century, founder after founder understood well and explained what the reason is for the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court, thankfully, I'm grateful to them, they rediscovered or articulated correctly what that was in the Heller case in 2008, when they said the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. It's not for a military organization, notwithstanding the reference to the militia in the clause. It is designed. It is another check and balance in exactly the same way the creation of a federal government with executive, federal, and legislative branches was. It was designed for people broadly to have weapons so that there could never be governmental tyranny. It would be almost impossible for the government to turn tyrannical or have some other outside force come in and try to pacify the United States. As General Tojo, I think it was, said in World War II, talking about the prospect of trying to invade the United States of America, he said there would be a gun behind every blade of grass. That has always been the case in America. Guns have always been here. And here's the thing I love to say to the Democrats, because I think the answer to their gun grabs is to indict them, counterattack them, because the fact that I just said is inarguable. We've always had prevalent guns in the United States since the nation was founded, and yet the mass shootings started in about the 1960s, and they were rare, and they are becoming increasingly common, and they're frightening to behold. But anybody who says that the answer to that is to get all the guns out of society needs to account for that fact that I just recited. And what I know, and I think frankly most everybody understands to be the case, is there's been about a 60-year determined campaign to destroy American culture. And the result of that is the reason that you see so much dependence, so much damage to family units, so many people who've gone awry and become isolated into odd behaviors and life existences, and they will find ways to kill people. And so the notion that you're going to improve that then by getting guns out of society is most errant of all. What you will have then, you'll have exactly those same sicknesses in society, that ill culture, and yet you also will have the inability for the population, broadly speaking, to protect its other rights, as you aptly said it. So, this is one thing on which civic education is sorely lacking at this point in time. And I think that's maybe one of the top roles that I've got as a member of Congress, is to talk about that in every opportunity that arises.
Yeah, I teach my kids, how to properly use guns, and also making sure that they understand what it's for. And I mean, if you look at the autonomous zones, right, those are areas where the police aren't going to protect you. And I think the Supreme Court, or at least different courts, have ruled that police actually have no obligation to protect you.
That's right.
in a place of violence. So the only person that you can depend upon is yourself. And it's easy to get training. It's easy to go out there and practice. And so I think there's more gun owners now in the United States. We added like 4 or 6 million new gun owners last year. So I think, in many ways, the Second Amendment has never been stronger, because a lot of people realize a lot of the talking points from the other side just aren't accurate at all.
I think you're right. And we have 400 million some odd guns in the United States. I think they'd have a hell of a time trying to confiscate them here, but the dangers are out there. If you look at the news development just yesterday, I believe it was, in California, where they had a comprehensive, you've heard people talk about gun registries, and some people fear that. And then people say, well, what's the harm of a gun registry? Well, you saw what happens with that in California, where they published, they say inadvertently on the internet, the name and address of every concealed carry permit holder in California yesterday. And that's what happens when government is out there eroding your rights. And so I agree with you. I think the Second Amendment is stronger than it has been in my lifetime. But I believe that vigilance on that score is important. So this bill that we just passed out of the Congress, the worst thing about that, Robert, is, in my view, is that 17 Republican senators made this deal with the Democrats. Frankly, there's a lot. There are a couple things that are innocuous. I believe the possibility of getting into juvenile records to do background checks may be appropriate, but the rest of the bill, the red flag laws, are by definition some reduction of due process for taking away the people's, individuals' right to keep and bear arms. And I even think, the Republicans are fond now of talking all about increasing resources for mental health. But what they're actually doing there is creating a big, massive bureaucracy to pump Medicaid and CHIP program money into local school boards, school agencies. And they're going to create this so-called mental health access that's culturally appropriate. That ought to raise the hackles on the back of your neck when they use that particular euphemism. What that means is beyond the reach of parents and probably beyond common sense if some of the gender transition, whatever they call that stuff.
Sure, if you believe that God created man as man and woman as woman, and they say, hey, well, then you can't own a gun because that is you have a mental disorder. Because
100%. And if they don't do that to you and me as adults, they'll do it to your kid, right? Your kid will be drummed out or pulled aside and given mental health services in the schools, public schools, if they believe in the Second Amendment and the roots of it in our Constitution.
So we hear this thing about a red wave. Of course, we got to do the work, and of course, sometimes the red, as you said, the 17 Republicans who betrayed us. But what can we expect out of Congress and out of Republicans should the American people decide to give the houses back to you?
As an introduction to my answer, let me say, because I did just speak about 17 Republican senators doing the wrong thing, and Republicans frequently do things they shouldn't do in Congress. And then some folks out there that might be inclined to agree with you and me, Robert, might say, well, what's the purpose of all of it? Let's just get a third party or just quit paying attention. A Republican majority is necessary, but not sufficient. That is to say, Republican Party is the only prospect for defending freedom. And yet we've got to continue to work to replace rhinos with the people who believe in the Constitution and believe in liberty and intend to stand up for them. So we're still, that's still a game that's not nearly finished. And so we do need to have a red wave. I hope we will. I will also say, let's understand then where we'll be. And again, this is something, civic education being what it is, a lot of people may not know, but they should. The White House will still be in the hands of Joe Biden, Democrats. We will not have, there's no prospect of having 60 Republican senators in order to have the necessary votes to overcome a filibuster in the Senate. So we need to pass important bills, but most of them probably will not become law. The very most important function that we need to seize with both hands and get after is oversight. Congress needs to use every bit of its power to dig into the depths of what Joe Biden's administration has done and is doing. We need to investigate the one that's at the top of my list where I sit on Jordan's Judiciary Committee is to dig into Merrick Garland and the Justice Department's exercise of surveillance power over over citizens. The incident where he sort of sent out the national directive to scrutinize parents who were showing up in school board meetings to speak out against ridiculous COVID policies, and also this kind of crazy ideological indoctrination. And so, I think that American people have seen very clearly that there are two standards of justice based on ideological positioning in this country. And we need to ferret out every example of that we can. We need to find out how many federal agents and informants were on the scene on January 6th. What is the deal about Ray Epps? Those kinds of questions. So we need to be relentless in oversight. There's much to do. Some people would say, well, you're going to relitigate old questions. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about digging in to what the administration is using executive power or exceeding executive power to accomplish right now. And every committee in Congress, but particularly the Judiciary Committee on which I sit, the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform on which I might sit, but I don't now, and Homeland Security on which I sit, those need to be oversight juggernauts.
100% agree. And it seemed like the Republicans left us wanting more when Obama was in office. I don't know if they were afraid because he was the first Black president or not, but hopefully if Kevin McCarthy is elected the House leader, which, I wouldn't oppose somebody else being elected, but he's most likely going to be the one. hopefully he'll have the gumption to do what needs to be done to protect our democracy.
I will tell you, Robert, that we have meetings on that score, have had already. I've sat there with McCarthy and a handful of others in the last 10 days, and the planning is advancing on that. There's a fair amount to it. You got to do it in a shrewd way. But I do not believe we're going to fail to do it because we're too tepid. At least that's my expectation now. And I can guarantee that on Jordan's Judiciary Committee, we're going to be after it.
Awesome. Now you're a member of the House Freedom Caucus. And so
Correct.
What does that mean? What are these different caucuses and why the House Freedom Caucus?
So members voluntarily join various caucuses it's something that's gone on for many, many years. There's a Second Amendment caucus. There's a Sportsman's caucus, a variety of things. The House Freedom Caucus, in my view, is the most significant one. It was started by Jordan and Mark Meadows and 7 others. I think there were 9 original members, and maybe it was as far back as 2009. That may be, I don't know if it was that far back or not. I think so, but it was formed to hold Republicans accountable for freedom, for advancing the ball. Many of us have observed that in some ways you understand it and can appreciate the fact that you want to be on the Republican team. You don't want to devolve into sort of a factional, disputatious kind of inability to get along, because you got to get along with people to make legislation move. However, it also is true that when Republicans have had the majority, we've whiffed at the ball twice. Not just 2 incidents, but I'm talking about 2 times. So when John Boehner was Speaker, and then when Paul Ryan was Speaker, in separate Congresses, we failed to do what we told the American people we would do. And that can't happen anymore. Now, Freedom Caucus exists. It was Mark Meadows and who filed motion to vacate the chair against Boehner. That was the first step in a series of developments that resulted in Boehner stepping down. And Freedom Caucus has continued to be, despite change of personnel, the group that says we're not going to fail. We're going to hold you accountable to the American people. And it's something that makes them mad. They have these things called suspensions. Votes that are taken under suspension of the rules is done all the time. And all these things pass into law or pass through the House on a voice vote with, frankly, a handful of people in the chamber, and most members never know about it. And we in Freedom Caucus decided we had 2 roles this Congress. One was to communicate to the American people what's happening up there, and the other one was to throw sand in the gears and slow them down. And the way we chose to do that was to have a Freedom Caucus member on the floor every time one of those things came up, and we require them to be voted on. And it's made some of our Republican colleagues furious that we're wasting their time, or some bill that would require another report from the Department of Homeland Security or something has to get a vote as opposed to just pass by voice. And I worried about them being mad for a while, but after a while, I stopped worrying about that. That's why we're in Washington. And if they don't like it, then we're just going to have as agreeably as possible, I'm going to disagree with them. And if they're mad, then they're mad.
Well, on behalf of myself and I think the American people, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
What current bills that you have sponsored are you most passionate about, or feel like could have an actual positive impact?
I think I can't name a bill, but I can tell you what I think the 2 things will be that I know will be a focal point in the coming Congress. There are many, but there are 2 legislative issues I would point to that are responsive. The first one is job 1 must be to fix its immigration loopholes and border security. And this notion that millions of people can enter the United States and be released on their own recognizance because they have a claim of a right to asylum that 90% will never be able to vindicate. That is a huge perversion of American international law or American immigration law, and it's got to be fixed. It can be fixed. We need to move that and move it early and strong. The other thing I think is a more general perhaps, but what we've got to focus on is, with a less than 60 vote majority in the Senate, assuming we get a majority in the Senate, I think we should, And with Biden sitting in the White House, there is a legislative opportunity, but it's got to be built around the appropriations process. We need to make sure, and I know Jim's on board, Jordan's on board with this. I've heard him say it a lot. We've got to, at an early point in the appropriations process, get a list of critical things like the one I just mentioned and say, we're not rolling forward without this being done. And ultimately, it implies the question of whether you'd be willing to shut down the government. But if you start it early enough on, and it takes it's in all the negotiations from the beginning, you can do that. So you've got to be willing to use the appropriations process, demand the individual bills, 12 individual bills come forward, and take appropriate steps to make changes in those bills by lining out, by prohibiting spending of any dollars on, for example, the continued processing of individuals under a bridge in Texas where they'll just come into the United States. So those are the things that have to be done. You got to use the appropriations process. And I think immigration border security is first thing to be fixed.
Well, if you shut down the federal government for about 2 years until 2024, I'd be fine with me. But I'm probably in the minority there.
No, I don't know if I want to go quite that strong, but one wonders what would maybe we've discovered that we don't need it at all.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't go on record to say anything about that. But yeah, don't tempt me with a good time. All right, so we've got a lot of people who are passionate, maybe tired of groceries going up, gas going up. They might feel kind of helpless, but they aren't. And I believe that all of us should get involved in our local elections. I know I've been knocking on doors since I was about 9 years old. So when you're talking to someone who's frustrated, like what are some ways that they can get involved, whether here in North Carolina or whatever state they're in?
Robert, first of all, I'm glad you brought this subject up, and let me actually use you as an example if I can.
Go ahead.
I don't know your parents well, but I met them. I know about Classical Conversations, the nature of the business that you guys have created. It is a business that thrives because it serves freedom-loving people who want to take control of their children's education. So my compliments to your parents, because one reason I imagine that you've developed into the person you are and have the heart for freedom that you have is because you were exposed to those ideas from your parents. All of us have to learn about government and the reason that we're given such a blessing in the form of government we have in the United States, why it has led to the most flourishing society in the history of the world, why it is superior, for example, in the Second Amendment that we were talking about at the front of the conversation. Why, because you don't necessarily get it until you have a reasonable view of history, because everybody goes, well, gun, boy, that's awful. Somebody can get hurt or killed with a gun. Yeah, but when you look at the sweep of history and you see what tyranny has done to people, communism killed 60 million people, the enormous numbers where it's been done in the world, all sorts of tyrannies that have existed. A bulwark against tyranny is something that has been devised. I think people figured it out over time. And that's why you've got to hold on to it with both hands. So education is critical. And the left has managed to almost complete the long march through the institutions in the United States. We've lost higher ed to the left. We've lost the media. We've lost big corporations in many cases. We've lost the federal bureaucracy, certainly the security state, the FBI and the CIA and State Department. You could say the same thing, might offend somebody in some ways. Churches, we've lost, and certainly mainline religion has become kind of destroyed by the left. So what we have left is a broad-based American public that has always enjoyed freedom, and many among us who are capable of recognizing the jeopardy that freedom is in and willingness to respond to it. So all those people that are within the sound of your voice in this broadcast and within the reach of your business, they need to do likewise. They need to teach their children. They need to show up in these school board meetings. And every time there's a lull and the leftists think they've kind of pacified it, show up again. They need to run for local offices. that's where, I can tell you that all along in Charlotte, which has become progressively bluer and is now definitely a one-party community and is moving on toward, a Marxist-led community. Imagine that I've come to Congress from there. It is only by, frankly, barely escaping the onrushing tide of liberalism, of blue politics in Mecklenburg County. Where will the next member of Congress come from? Frankly, I think it'll have to be from where you live, Robert, because I think the opportunities for leaders to emerge from Charlotte who are believers in freedom that we've been talking about are increasingly nil. So you simply, there's no choice. It's not something you can sit back and expect to run on automatic pilot anymore. I see that by virtue of my involvement, my comparison of the way things have developed over time, I see the American people increasingly stepping forward and becoming involved. Do not let that, do not be discouraged in the doing of that. We have to do it. Also, make yourselves heard. I saw just this morning or just this afternoon as I was riding in that a senator's office was being picketed over that gun bill. Good. That's always something the left did and the right has never done it. I always believe that protests should be peaceful. I've always condemned, for example, the January 6th violence. The left doesn't condemn violence. We always should. However, we definitely should be present and engage in the First Amendment right to petition government for redress and speak up. So I think the American people have a feel for it that they have not fully had in many years. I'm very pumped. I'm very excited about the prospect of the next couple of years. The United States Supreme Court is finally putting justice right in this country in many respects. More decisions came out today. So, I think we've got a great opportunity both in this election and in the longer term, but we have to recognize the mammoth proportions of the task. We have to restore institutions that have been corrupted and co-opted by people who don't have the interests of freedom at heart.
It's great. I hope that said person I'm talking to, Congressman Bishop, might run against that person who's being picketed in 2026. Then I'll just take your seat in Congress. Then we'll have a Freedom Caucus.
The latter part, I think that'd be fantastic. You'd be fantastic. And people who understand it on your level are what we got to have. So I'm looking forward to anytime you announce, I'll step out of the way.
No, you got to step up. I need you to step up.
I heard what you said.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on here today. What's your website or social media places where people can connect with you if they want to find out more about what you're about?
Yeah, the best one to go to is the official House page for me, danbishop.house.gov. I'm going to say it again, danbishop.house.gov. And maybe the most significant thing there is there's a media tab that's got all the media interviews, all the committee appearances, all the times talking on the floor. If you want to find something to share, there's a big library of stuff there. And so occasionally we hit something where I asked the witness in the Judiciary Committee what she said a woman was, and the results were truly hilarious. So the left always reveals its insanity if you just give them an opportunity. That's my goal.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having us today. Good luck on your election. And of course, we'll be praying for you and doing a little bit more than that as well. So
thank you, Robert. It's great being with you.
All right. Now we're going to practice our 15 tools of learning and talking about current events. And we're going to talk about something on everyone's mind, and that is, are we in a recession? And with everything, we need to start with 5 core habits of grammar and naming and defining what is a recession. And recession is obviously something that is not great for the country, not great for our economy, not great for us as individuals trying to live a good life. And so there's a great debate on it, and there's an election coming up. And so if we are in a recession, that's usually not good for the party that's in power, as the voters blame them. And then the party that's not in power wants to use a recession to gain that power. And so one side is talking about this recession as a technical recession. And they're saying that, yes, we have had 2 negative quarters in a row where the gross domestic product has dropped. But the other signs of recession, such as high unemployment, are not coming into fruition right now. And so It's not really a recession, as in it's not affecting you, the daily individual, in your daily lives. And then the other side is saying, no, we're in a recession. It's just the beginning of the recession and things are going to get much worse. And so that's something that we're all talking about. And when we are listening to these experts trying to decide what we think and what we're going to do as Christians and as classicalists, we need to think about testimony. And the 5 common topics of dialectic, testimony is one of those tools, and it's discovering what others say. And so this is an economic issue. So we want to look at what these experts have said in the past about economic issues. Were they correct in the past? Were they wrong in the past? And so as we're listening to these individuals or reading about what they have to say, let's look at predictions they made about inflation. Inflation started, one side started talking about it in October, November of 2021 and in January, and saying that inflation is going to be bad, it's going to affect us. And they were right. Another group of experts were saying that inflation was transitory and that it was just a blip on the radar. And those individuals have been proven wrong. And so as we listen to these experts, were they right 9 months ago or were they wrong 9 months ago? And if they were wrong, have they changed their thinking, or are they actually just saying, yes, we admit that we were wrong, but their underlying dogmas haven't changed? Next, we need to look at the 5 canons of rhetoric, because if we are in recession, it could affect us. It could affect our loved ones. It could affect those that go to church with us. And we need to think about what are we doing now to prepare ourselves if a recession does come in place, and what to do next. And we're actually going to dive into that in part 2 of this 2-part series on recession. You can also go listen to Will McCreary in episode 14, where he talks about what he is doing during a potential downturn. One of the things that's very interesting about this technical recession is that the GDP is dropping while we have very high inflation. And I can tell you that that is not a normal historical occurrence, because if you have inflation, let's say it's at 9%, but GDP dropped 1%, that means we've actually consumed 10% less stuff, or bought 10% less stuff, because we're buying that 9% higher price. And GDP just looks at that gross domestic product, which is basically everything that was purchased inside the economy. So be sure to tune in to part 2, where we'll talk about what we can and should be doing, and if this recession is here to stay or just a blip on the radar.
Welcome to this episode of Classical Crypto with Will. Today we are going to answer the fundamental question and hopefully obtain some understanding on what a CBDC is. Now, before we answer this, we need to briefly review the digital landscape of blockchain technology and triple entry accounting. Many would say that blockchain technology is very special because it represents what we call DeFi, or decentralized finance. Bitcoin is an example of decentralized finance. Ethereum is another example, for the most part, of decentralized finance, meaning there's not one central governing agency controlling that currency. No one bad actor can increase or print the supply. No one bad actor can easily inflate or change the governance or rules by which the currency or value operates. Instead, the power, the validation, the transactions, everything is decentralized across thousands and thousands of governing nodes. Essentially, in my opinion, DeFi is governance by the many, and there's safety in that. Most current blockchain technologies are programmed and engineered in accordance to the philosophy of DeFi. And this lays the groundwork for our conversation today, because our government, the powers that be, they have all tried to shut down DeFi, and specifically Bitcoin. They've tried this multiple times, until most recently, all of a sudden, the government has seemingly given up that fight to stop DeFi. Fidelity and other major investment firms have been allowed to start offering crypto funds to their customers, and the doors have literally been swung wide open. Why is this? Well, part of the reason is that CBDCs have emerged on the scene. What does that mean? Okay, let's get into it. And the million-dollar question, what is a CBDC? Get this, a CBDC stands for Central Bank Digital Currency. Literally, it's an acronym. CB, Central Bank, DC, Digital Currency. It's almost laughable. It appears to be that old idiom, if you can't beat them, join them. This is true of the government, but it's also obvious to everyone in the space what is actually going on. A CBDC, a product of the central banking system, is adopting the revolutionary Bitcoin technology, but it's engineered to have central governance, meaning the bank can control every aspect of that currency. This includes the supply, usage, borders, location, tracers, etc. I hope that makes sense to you. This would be like Blockbuster, the old company out of business, trying to shut down Netflix for 15 years, then partnering with Netflix and using its platform to send you a smarter VHS. Like, it doesn't make sense. To many true DeFi believers, this is very disappointing because the dollar would be upgraded to a superior technology in Bitcoin, but the DeFi philosophy and framework that Bitcoin and all these blockchains emerged from will be obliterated by the central governance of, again, the central bank. So it'd be a huge bummer, in my opinion. Don't fall asleep. This isn't just some concept that we're talking about. These CBDCs are being experimented on all around the world. The Bahamas recently became the first nation to introduce a CBDC at scale as its official currency. It's called the Sand Dollar. Look it up. China is experimenting with its own digital yuan. According to JH Investments, 81 countries are now running CBDCs on beta testing. That's incredible. This shouldn't be a surprise. In this technological, informational age that we live in, fiat currencies will not survive. They are not built to integrate into the internet. Fiat's end is in sight. I just hope this is done the right way and we don't go back to the old system. There are two finance camps, decentralized and centralized finance. Which one do you agree with? Thanks for listening to Classical Crypto with Will today. Join us next time for a very special segment. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us today here on Refining Rhetoric. Be sure to join us in the future. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with a friend.